I think we are now ready to start. So we introduce you to Gabriella Ramos, Assistant to Director General for the Social and Human Science Sector for UNESCO, who will open the roundtable. Thank you, Gabriella, please.
Thank you so much, Oreo and Ambassador Oike. I see you there. It's great to have you with us, and also to have Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem, who is our dear chairperson of the group of experts that produced the recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this event. It's really a great pleasure to host you today in the fourth roundtable dedicated to exploring the critical issues at the heart of the ethics of artificial intelligence and governance. The conclusion, this discussion is concluding a set of roundtables on this topic that we have launched since 2018 with the very kind support of the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology of Japan. And I want to thank the government of Japan for their support and their confidence, and for the presence of the ambassador here with us. We see it day by day, not only because of COVID and the confinement and the massive movement to digital, but we see it day by day that artificial intelligence is increasingly present in single thing we do, in all of the domains of our life, in our workplace, in our leisure, making decisions, in the law enforcement, in governance and agriculture, banking, health, so many sectors that are changing the way they operate thanks to artificial intelligence. These general purpose technology are really feeding into very different ways of doing things that we used to do, and also to arrive to decisions and to efficiency and optimization that is bringing very good news for humankind. Some AI-powered technologies, like of course the search engines of internet, have become almost indispensable. Google, for example, gets over 3.5 billion searches every day. And of course, it really facilitates our lives. This is only one tip of the iceberg, but the reality is that more and more decisions in the public and the private sector are being taken with the support of the analytical power of artificial intelligence. But with this come all the ethical reflections that UNESCO has launched since the very beginning, to discuss how much this power of the technologies and the capacity with the sensors and with the data gathering and with the algorithmic development is imposing constraints to our privacy, is imposing constraints in so many other issues that we care about. In our previous roundtable on artificial intelligence and cultural diversity, we have reflected on the ethical challenges related to data bias and how lack of representativity in databases can bring unfair and reliable outcome. Because at the same time that we have this impressive technological progress, we still have the challenge to connect half of the world population to internet that are not connected. And therefore, the information that we are creating in the cyberspace might be already be biased because it's not totally representative. 4.9 billion people, 60% of the world's population use the internet, but we still, as I said, have 40% that need to be connected. And then artificial intelligence learn to interpret, these systems learn to interpret the world based on these databases. And I'm always saying what you put in is what you get out, because the training of the data, the information that the machines are trained to, it's already with a lot of content in terms of the context, in terms of the culture, in terms of the people that are included or the systems that are included. And therefore, if there is no data available from certain cultures, AI will therefore show us the world as if those cultures do not exist. The culture, the language, all the expressions of cultural diversity that is so rich in the world is still a challenge to be represented in the AI world. And so with or without internet, these perspectives, traditional values and culture should not be neglected. And so we are convinced that cultural diversity should nourish the development of artificial intelligence to make it beneficial for all. And during today's roundtable, we will see the need on how this cultural diversity can shape the governance of artificial intelligence. And we need to have a very clear vision on what it means to bring different values into AI developments and regulations. And at least to have this more open space, open mind to discuss what works in what place, what doesn't, and how we can learn from each other on the very different elements that shape our own definitions of governance. But governance needs to be global because the technologies are global. And that's why we are super proud to have seen the approval of the recommendations on the ethics of AI by 193 countries at UNESCO last November. And again, our deep thanks to Japan and to all the member states that put this mandate in UNESCO, but also that pursue the development of the instrument. Thanks to Emma for steering the substantive debate, but also the members and the Ambassador Al-Mula who was chairing the negotiations, because at the end it showed that the ethical framing of artificial intelligence is long overdue. We have been enamored by the technological progress. We have been just flabbergasted by the way the technologies can derive so many interesting outcomes, but we need to align them with the ethical reflection. And this ethical reflection is nothing else than ensuring that the outcomes of the technological progress is inclusive or are inclusive, are fair, and are human-centric, and are respectful of human rights and human dignity. And this is exactly the framework that was developed for the recommendation. And the call is really to bring everybody together for implementation. Let me tell you that we did not only see this approval, but we have now a movement, a wave of participating countries that are helping us to make the instrument count. Because of course, one thing is to agree on a recommendation or an instrument. Another thing is to implement it. But we have now 60 countries that want to pioneer the advancement of the recommendation. Again, we have the support of Japan to implement this, the two tools that we are called to develop on the ethical impact assessment and the readiness assessment in Africa. And therefore, just a call to say thanks to them, but also to everybody that we need all hands on deck to make sure that the recommendation delivers. So we are very pleased to have this discussion today. What is it to be diverse, and how governance will change, the governance of AI will change if diversity is ensured. And we are lucky to have a multidisciplinary and also multicultural panel of experts with Professor Souza, Professor of Rio de Janeiro, with Dr. Sabelo Mlabi from Stanford, and also with Dr. Borocchini. And I have to say, an impressive Ugandan feminist collective and civic technology organization with he worked, and Dr. Ellen Broad, who is associate professor at the 3A Institute in Australian National University. And therefore, I pass over to Professor Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem. Well, I first want to hear from our dear Ambassador Oiki, a representative of Japan to UNESCO, and then we will pass the floor to Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem, who, as I said, was the chair of the development of the recommendation, but also member of our committee for the ethics of science and technology. So thank you for joining us. Looking forward to this very interesting discussion and timely. And over to you, Ambassador Oike.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Ramos. Madam Ramos, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for me to make a few remarks to you on behalf of the Japanese government at its fourth roundtable on the ethics of artificial intelligence. The progress of AI technology in recent years has been remarkable, bringing AI ever closer to our daily lives. AI will be the key technology for solving many of the problems that our current societies are facing, and for contributing to the achievement of the SDGs. On the other hand, we have recognized that appropriate development and accurate understanding, knowledge to make correct use of AI socially, and clearly defined ethical principles are required because of AI's enormous impact on society. This is the fourth roundtable of the series, which aim to discuss the impact of the progress in AI technology on our society from an ethical perspective. The roundtables held so far are summarized in videos in respective themes and have been released to the world on YouTube. If you haven't seen them yet, I would be grateful if you could take a look there as well. The UNESCO General Conference held last fall marked a historic moment by adopting the recommendation of the ethics of AI. Japan has provided intellectual and financial support during the 2-year drafting process of the recommendation. We think it is important for each country to implement this recommendation steadily in the future. With this in mind, Japan has decided to start supporting projects in Africa together with you, Madame Ramos, in the near future, Africa and SIDS in the near future. Finally, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to the Assistant Director General, Madame Gabriella Ramos, once again, and for all the officers involved in the UNESCO Secretariat who have made such great efforts for this roundtable series. And I would also like to express my deep-felt appreciation to the speakers today for taking time to participate in this important project. I hope today's roundtable will again raise interest in and attention to the ethics of AI and further enhance our thinking on this issue. Thank you very much, Madam Ramos.
And now over, thank you so much, Ambassador. Now over to our dear Emma. Go for it,
Thank you very
Emma.
much. Thank you, ADG Ramos. Thank you, Ambassador Oike. It is really, thank you for inviting me. This is going to be a really interesting session. It is a big privilege to be the moderator for this session. So I think that most of us believe that AI technology, if harnessed appropriately, can deliver great benefits for economies and society and support decision-making, which is safer and more informed than it would otherwise have been, perhaps, or not perhaps, certainly. And in theory, could be fairer and more inclusive. But given the possibility of structural bias in data, possibly skewing outcomes and amplifying existing identity prejudice among other possible impacts on society, AI technology must be governed responsibly throughout the full life cycle of these systems, and issues of ethical and legal oversight must be addressed. So AI governance is a framework or a process that practically guides the research, design, development, deployment, and use and end of use of AI technologies, such that these systems are explainable and interpretable, transparent, and ethical overall. This guidance, and I have to add, ethical and lawful. This guidance that is provided by the AI governance framework is based on existing regulation or legislation in the domain and must ultimately always conform with international law. To effect successful guidance, AI governance includes a variety of tools, solutions that influence AI development and applications, such as impact assessment, best practice sharing, post-hoc analyses, and so on. And the overall aim is to promote ethics and value frameworks in the AI domain. Effective AI governance thus necessitates continuous studies of the effects and societal implications of AI technologies and raising awareness for stakeholders of certain ethical and legal concerns. And of course, it implies continuous monitoring of compliance with existing regulatory and legislative frameworks. But there is a number of challenges. There is still, although we have the huge success of the UNESCO recommendation, there is still not overall international consensus on all points. There is a certain and definite lack of diversity in AI ethics debates. And we know that AI ethics policymaking is dominated by the global north and also a small number of private companies. So, for instance, if we think, and this on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want our values and principles that guide the policy making to be as reflective as possible of different ethical concerns in terms of different cultures. For instance, the issue of data ownership in Africa is a serious concern that may not be flagged in the same way in Northern policy discussions. So there are many policy guidelines available. Algorithm Watch tells us that there are close to 200. They are intergovernmental, national, professional, and private sector guidelines. And famously, over the past year or so in AI ethics literature, many concerns have been raised about the actionability of these guidelines. So the challenge that we face and that we want to focus on when we talk about AI governance is how to concretize abstract principles. And this includes how to translate and communicate ethical concerns to the technical community and ensure accountability in the process. So some implications of this is that obviously we need capacity in AI ethics. We need literacy and awareness in civil society, but also in the private sector and government. We need inclusivity, not just in terms of gender, which is extremely important, but also in terms of cultural diversity. And we need interdisciplinary approaches. Key areas for clarification and action in terms of AI governance would include explainability standards, obviously, and building in checks in terms of how explainability is received by laypersons, fairness appraisals. We have to really pay attention to a classification ethics. And a third maybe key area for clarification is, of course, safety concerns in terms of robustness and accuracy, and then human AI collaboration and proportionality. So we should find the best risk-based engagements with these technologies so that we ensure that we never exceed the purpose for which the technology is being applied. And then, of course, liability frameworks. We have to evaluate potential weaknesses in existing liability rules and explore complementary rules for specific high-risk applications. So with that, I welcome you again to this discussion and the four speakers, Ms. Favor Borokini, Mr. Carlos de Souza, Mr. Sabelo Mushlambi, and Ms. Ellen Broad. And I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker then, which is Ms. Favor Borokini. Favor is an AI and tech policy researcher. She currently works as a data and digital rights researcher with Policy, which is an award-winning Ugandan feminist collective and civic technology organization, where she researches questions and problems posed by AI and other technologies on social justice and inequality in Africa, with an emphasis on African women. She also researches with the Africa Data Governance Initiative, Responsible Data Governance for AI, and is a content writer for Ethical Intelligence, which is a UK technology ethics consulting firm. Favor, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ruttkamp-Bloem. Before I proceed, I'd like to confirm if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it's very good to be on this very important panel today. My name is Favor Borokini, and I am a Nigerian tech policy researcher. And as Professor Ruttkamp-Bloem already mentioned, I work with Policy, a Ugandan feminist collective, where I research the impact of data and emerging and subsisting technologies on women. I am particularly fascinated by emerging technologies though, like AI and VR and the Internet of Things, and how their use and impact on women is often overlooked in favor of serious topics, I put serious in quotes, like national security. I am interested how technologies like artificial intelligence is shaping the way women contribute to society and the way women are viewed in society today. So I think that in many places this discussion is being had, there is a way that the impact of technology on women is viewed as a soft topic, or a way that the impact of deep technology, for instance, and the impact of how it could be used to fabricate pornography, or the way it could be used to perpetuate online scams or dating scams on women is sort of viewed as a less important or a soft topic that pales in comparison to subjects like national security, for instance, and I'm very interested in those so-called soft subjects. In Africa today, I can see that a number of countries like Tunisia, Ghana, Mauritius are developing or have developed their national AI strategies. Some more African countries are slowly but surely waking up to the importance of data protection regulation. And this is very important due to the impact of data on AI. And if we are talking about development of Africa-led or Africa-born technology or artificial intelligence that we can call our own, then we definitely need to be thinking more about data, how it is collected, how it is processed, how it is siloed. And I think an important principle, well, more of a notion that I would like to see more people discuss or approach AI governance with is one that centers the needs of those most likely to be affected or impacted by AI itself. So here I'm referring to vulnerable groups like women, the elderly, the disabled, persons disenfranchised due to ethnicity, gender presentation, sexual orientation, and less of the sort of one-size-fits-all human rights-centered approach that doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of who the most likely people to be vulnerable are. So I am basically referring to a principle of fairness, a feminist-centered principle, one that centers the vulnerable, the disenfranchised, minority groups, essentially. And I think that there is a tendency to favor something neutral, something general that is based on human rights and democracy. But by focusing on neutrality and a sort of humanism-directed principle or approach to AI, we risk overlooking the most vulnerable people and groups in our societies today. And in developing this approach, I believe we need to see more of the political will from our legislators. These are the people who are making these laws. They are the ones with power to repeal, with power to amend, with the power to pass legislation, to push for legislation. And I believe more work needs to be done with civil society groups, people who are close to the grassroots level, people who have experience working with these vulnerable groups. And we need to integrate innovation with ethical frameworks that de-emphasize innovation for the sake of innovation, or arguably worse, innovation that is done primarily for ease. I once read this article that talks about the tyranny of comfort, of ease, and how searching for a way to make our lives better, primarily, or innovating for the sake of ease, or there's this other word, but it's definitely a synonym for ease, could lead to situations where we are perpetuating certain stereotypes and we are developing surveillance technologies that makes life arguably worse for people who are already over-securitized and over-surveilled. And so we need to be careful about that. We need to evaluate what goes on in the rooms, in the chambers where innovation is taking place. And we need to embed and encode technology to ensure that progress is made, so that lives are made better, and so that we do not worsen social justice and social oppression and the dynamic between majority and minority groups in society today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Favor. That was great and very thought-provoking. I think one of the most important ingredients of this roundtable will be the focus on vulnerable groups, as you mentioned, and then also on different cultures, on cultural diversity. So thank you very much for your talk. So we move then now to the second speaker. Sorry, I want to switch on my video while I introduce him. It's always for me so disembodied and unhuman not to see someone's face. So the next speaker is Mr. Carlos Affonso de Souza. Carlos is Director of the Institute of Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro, Professor of Law at the Rio de Janeiro State University, Visiting Professor at the University of Ottawa Law School, and Affiliated Fellow with Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Professor Souza is a member of the Executive Committee of the Global Network of Internet and Society Research Centers, which encompasses more than 100 research centers, and the network is currently working on projects on AI and inclusion and ethics of digitalization. Over to you, Alfonso.
Thanks, Professor Ruttkamp. And first of all, thanks to UNESCO for this very kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be able to join you all today to discuss issues concerning diversity and inclusion under an ethical framework for AI. And it's really nice to see how UNESCO end up organizing that series of panels that end up fostering the debate and a global debate on this agenda. I speak from Rio de Janeiro, from Brazil, and it's very, very interesting to address such an issue, looking through what the region has been doing on the issues of AI regulation and governance. First of all, I think it's important to understand that not all, of course, countries in Latin America have their own national strategy on AI, but we might all agree that the countries might end up being caught in a progression or a change of phase on how we address issues concerning AI governance and regulation, especially because in the last decades, we've seen so many charters, declarations, broad statements on ethical principles for AI. And it seems like, especially in the last 5 years, we end up going from those very broad statements and charters into national strategies so that governments could plan ahead on how AI might unlock a better economic future prosperity for their own country. But if on the same side, or same time, it's very interesting to see government planning ahead on how AI will change for the better their own population. It's important to understand the risks that are involved in AI governance and regulation, and make sure that we understand the specific context that every single country might end up entering into this debate. And that's the moment in which we go from national strategy to national regulations on AI. And the risk that we have here is that we end up not including all the voices, and we have all the representation that we would like to have in this debate on the national level. Just to give out one example, one very common principle when we address issues of ethical principles for AI is fairness. Fairness is a principle that we might all understand, but when you come down to translating fairness to some languages, such as Portuguese and Spanish, widely spoken in Latin America and the Caribbean, there is no translation for fairness, no direct translation for fairness. How we're going to translate that? Is it like justice? it is different how even an ethical principle for AI might be translated and understood by different representations, by different communities on the national level. So I would just conclude here this very first comment to say that when we look at what happened in the regulation of the internet in the last 20 years, it's interesting to see that some countries in Latin America, and especially Brazil, end up providing large number of users to internet platforms. But the countries of the region might not be seen as protagonists on the major changes that internet might end up delivering on our everyday lives. So the question that we have now with AI is, how do we create a governance structure for AI? And we might end up having a regulation that is forward-looking and that takes into account intergenerational effects on a way that countries such as Brazil might end up turning into protagonists in the global conversation of AI governance, and not just countries that end up delivering huge number of users that might help to tweak some AI-based tool in the near future. So that is the challenge that we face ahead, and that's the challenge that will involve, that's for sure, a lot of thoughtful experiments on how do we improve multi-stakeholder engagements, and we make sure that different voices are heard in a global debate on AI governance and regulation. But I'll stop here because that's my 5 minutes. We can definitely come back to the issues of how can we devise that multi-stakeholder engagements in after hearing from the other panelists on this session. And thanks again.
Thank you, Affonso. Yes, we will definitely come back to that when we have our general discussion. I think it is a really important point, and not only in Latin America, but also in Africa. But even in the global north, it may still need some attention. So I'm going to move to the next speaker, who is Ms. Ellen Broad. Let me just see. Ellen is an assistant professor at the Free A Institute within the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University, and she's a member of the Australian Government's Data Advisory Council. She's a lawyer and has previously held positions including head of policy for the Open Data Institute in London, ministerial advisor on data to senior UK cabinet ministers. She focuses on responsible and ethical designing of machines and on examining some of the fundamental values on why they are built. Thank you, Ellen. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Unesco, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And it's been really great listening to both Favor and Carlos making such interesting points. I was reflecting, just listening to our conversation, how much has changed in the way that we talk about artificial intelligence over the last decade. I know that when I started working on issues of digital rights and privacy and access to information, you could usually count on one hand the people in your internet governance discussion who were really advocating for fundamental changes in the way we design digital technologies. I think the Assistant Director General, Gabriella Ramos, used a line that I wrote down, that we have been too enamored with technical outcomes. And I think definitely for the earlier part of my career, talking about the challenges and the harms that could occur using technology was seen as raining on the parade or being a party pooper. I don't know how you would translate that into French. And so it's actually quite pleasing to me to see how far the conversation has come in that decade, that we are now starting to talk more seriously about the role that AI systems have in our lives long term, and what it means to talk about them in terms of life cycle and context and culture and diversity. That's really different, and it's a sign of a maturing of our conversation. That said, there's a few things that I still think about when we talk about AI ethics. And one of those kind of thoughts that I still have is that we're still incredibly young. Computing as an industry is only 75 years old. We only started talking about forms of data protection regulation in the 1980s and 90s. We've only moved to talking about regulation of AI in the last decade. And so something that I quite often think about is the journey some of our other general purpose suites of technologies have gone on. And one that always springs to mind for me is electricity, which is never one technology or one application. It refers to the use of something that powers many different industries and contexts, that takes many different forms and is regulated in many different ways. I think that's the journey that ultimately we will be on with AI regulation as well. AI as a term does not refer to one technology. Underneath that umbrella is a constellation of tools and techniques used in a variety of contexts for everything from spam filtering to making decisions about who is likely to recommit a crime. And some of those are higher stakes and potentially more consequential decisions than others. And I think ultimately we'll fragment our approach to AI regulation. We'll move away from umbrella bills that attempt to take a bite of the whole AI intelligence as though it's one concrete entity, and instead start to look at our uses of different kinds of systems that automate interactions that we have. Something that I really picked up from Favor and Carlos's contributions are these dynamics of power that underpin our discussions around artificial intelligence. And in fact, something that's frustrated me about our AI ethics discussions is in some contexts, they've really succeeded in turning the focus of discussions back to technologies, again, to technology systems themselves, divorced from culture and diversity and power. Some of the things that we would like to enable the development of AI systems in more diverse places, involving more diverse voices, we're actually practically unable to achieve with the limitations that we have in computing infrastructure. And I don't mean that simply in, for example, the Global South, more that our ability to develop systems that are as powerful as the systems that are currently used in a number of corporate contexts, that capability is held in very small, particularly corporate contexts. You know, we as researchers, for example, don't have access frequently to the volumes of data, the computing power that we would need to develop products and services that can compete. So there's these broader dynamics of power, equity, and access that I think are part of these conversations. And I'm always interested in, Emma used a term, accountability. I'm not so interested in whether an outcome is ethical, because I'm from the School of Cybernetics, and cybernetics is very concerned with the interplay of the human, the technical, and the environmental, and is very interested in holistic interactive systems, views the world as dynamic and changing. And if you accept that the context that you are in is changing all of the time, an ethical outcome is never assured. You can never be sure that your outcome is fair, or that you are not causing harm, because the context around you changes all the time. People's expectations change. Your influence in that context has effects. And so I've become less interested in whether I can achieve or promote an ethical outcome through regulation, and more interested in, can we hold organizations to account for a broader set of responsible practices? Can they make accessible and available the infrastructure, the data, the tooling that they're using? How would I hold them to account when things fail? Because they will. It is part of producing technologies in a dynamic, changing environment, just as we have to take into account for any other kind of engineered product or service. Bridges, residences, planes, we are always concerned with what happens at the edges and the margins. So I think that's where I would leave just my opening comments, is that I'm really interested in these broader dynamics of power and access that make conversations about more diverse AI, more equitable AI harder, and that I'm very interested in accountability as a foregrounding concept more than I'm interested in whether the outcome is ethical.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Very important issues raised, and definitely time for us to move to considering accountability, especially if we're now looking at actionable AI governance. Yes. Thank you very much. Looking forward to coming back to this in a little while. But now I want to introduce our fourth speaker. Sorry, I just need to find the bio. Okay. Welcome, Mr. Sabelo Mshlambi, who is our last speaker, or the fourth speaker. Sabelo is practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab and the founder of Bala AI, fellow at the Bergman and Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. And he is a computer scientist and researcher whose work focuses on the ethical implications of technology in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, along with the creation of tools to make AI more accessible and inclusive to underrepresented communities. He's the founder, as we said, of Bala AI, which is an AI startup that democratizes the advances of AI through natural language processing of African languages. Over to you, Sabelo. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor to be here. I also like the statements and the comments made by the previous speaker, Ellen, and I think they also mirror some of my comments as well. When thinking about the challenges of AI, at least from a sub-Saharan African perspective or a global south, I like to think even so much as the ethical frameworks that we're bringing into discussion. One of the challenges that we've noticed is that when we're creating a set of technology with a particular lens that may reflect a set of values, if those values don't necessarily mirror the values in other regions, we're likely to see problems, right? And so this also happens as a result of who even has the capability to produce such technology. So my background as well is in AI. I create technology, and when people such as myself create tools, we're often trying to solve a problem that we've identified. So we immediately bring our biases into the process. So we're trying to shape the world into some way that maybe might mirror our own values. Now, when we have systematically the same regions, the same corporations, the same countries and places creating such tools, which are then deployed globally, it may not quite mirror some of the nuances that are there. And so in such cases, then we can then ask, well, are there any, say, ethical limitations, right? Is it fair to produce technology beyond its ethical border as technology goes on to sort of a new ethical territory, if we can call it that? So some of the work that I've done to try to think about these challenges, at least in the sub-Saharan African context, is to then begin to look at, well, if we're having difficulties with artificial intelligence, I think we can all agree that there are some biases, there are some harms, and there are some challenges we have with that. Well, then where exactly do we have to, or what are the steps we can take to try to address these problems? Something that we'll hear a lot within the technical community is that, well, we just need to have more data. With more data, we can have better AI, or maybe even have bigger models, right? Let's just make, have larger models, which will then be more accurate. But I think this also sort of ignores the fact that, it doesn't matter how much data we have, we always bring these biases into the process of creating AI. And I think if we look even further and closer, we can sort of start to unravel the guiding philosophy, the guiding values, the guiding system behind why we even create AI, how it's even created. If we go back, for example, to to the origins of AI, the philosophical origins of AI, and this idea that we're trying to sort of create machines that are, let's say, human-like, that can produce human tasks, that can perform better than us. Well, one is to ask, well, what does it mean to be a human in the first place, right? And I find that that question is answered differently in different societies. If being a human is simply being rational and, a rational being, then we immediately require AI to just do the rational mathematical thing, as opposed to actually taking more care into what are the goals of AI. Now, for example, if we say, well, to be human is not just to be rational, but maybe even to be relational. Now we have a mandate that we should go beyond sort of like the logic and the mathematical structures and to figure out how does AI actually operate within this context of relationality, but what are the different components that are required in this step? And I think that that simple small switch itself from even defining sort of the essential definition of being human can even allow us to think differently about AI. And so these are some of the examples that we can find by simply switching over to different conceptions of ethical systems and how we can sort of define what are the goals of AI, what are the guiding philosophies. The last thing I want to say about that as well is that in some of these regions, the developing regions, the conversations are not mature yet to really talk about the ethics of AI. There are other pressing concerns. There are other limitations, infrastructure concerns as well. And even if the infrastructure were there, something that's often missed is sort of the economic inequality. And that's a really big discussion that is also shaping what some of you may know or have heard of as decolonizing AI. And with this economic inequality, the main concern there, one of the main concerns is that in the developing regions, we often find that finished products are delivered to consumers. And so these consumers have no say or shape in anything, in sort of deciding or defining the products that they use. And so what does it mean then to have sort of a population kind of always dependent on technology that's created, not through their own means, but it's sort of like created from them and delivered to them. In some ways, this mirrors the historical colonial relationship where the resources are extracted, such as the minerals, and then the products are made abroad, and then they're brought back to the original, to the developing world to be sold as finished products. This sort of removes the local populations from the power to shape and create their own technology. And at least within the African continent, this is a discussion that is happening, which is, it looks like if it's not correctly addressed, it might keep sort of this power relationship unequal for some time to come. And so these are some of the challenges when it comes to governance, ethics, which ethical systems are we even talking about, who is empowered, what are the economic challenges, what are the infrastructure challenges, who gets to participate, who gets to design their finished goods according to their own values, according to their own goals, who has the ability to shape their own technological future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sabelo. That is it. I'm actually very glad that you, in a sense, end off the introductory talks, but you also open the floor for our kind of roundtable discussions. So I'm going to, for a while now, pick up on some of the some points in each of the 4 introductory remarks and ask each of the 4 speakers to comment on 1 or 2 issues, and then we will take questions in the Q&A, and you are very welcome, the audience, to please post any questions in the Q&A box. And if you have a particular question for a particular panelist, please just add their name, so it makes it a bit easier for us. But we do want to give the audience also time, so please don't be shy to pose your questions. We don't want to just keep it the conversation among the 5 of us. We would like to speak to all of you. So one very important point, that issue that it has been raised in different ways, is the challenges to raising civil awareness of this need for efficient AI governance, and specifically in vulnerable groups in society that really may have other issues to concern themselves with, but can also be harmed by these technologies, even in the situation in which they are. So how do we raise civil awareness in these kinds of contexts? And how, does it differ between the global north and the global south? And related to that is then the issue of who are the suitable actors to regulate, to be the governors of AI? Who should be the champions, the protagonists in terms of AI governance? Carlos mentioned that it's an important issue at the moment in Brazil and in Latin America. It's very clear from what Sabelo has said that this is also an issue in sub-Saharan Africa. It is clear from what Favor has said, the same holds for West Africa, and then also obviously Ellen's concerns with accountability. So I wonder if you could maybe, if each speaker, and we can maybe go in the order in which you made your introductory remarks. So say maybe if you have any thoughts on how we can meet the challenges to raising civil awareness of different groupings in societies, and specifically in the global south, and then who you think the suitable actors would be to regulate AI technologies. How do we ensure that it isn't just the same people? How do we ensure that there is no algorithmic and governance colonialization taking place again? So I'm going to hand to Favor. Any comments on those two issues?
Well, I think that if we are talking about raising civil awareness and improving civic engagement, that first of all, we need to consider the needs of civil society groups that are already doing this work. And one very important need is funding. And I think this is sort of a difference between civil society groups in the global north and in the global south. There has been a lot written about, well, how dependent global south civic groups are dependent on funding, and how the funding that we get from the global south, for instance, influences some of the research or some of the outreaches and engagements that we are involved with. So I think that there is that. And then there's also the need for engagement, education at all levels. So for instance, in Nigeria, we are approaching an election year, and there's a lot of talk about how everybody needs to get registered in order to get a voting card so that you can vote in leaders. And I feel that the sort of preoccupation with getting registered and getting your voter's card sort of detracts from the conversation that a lot of the electorate is not adequately informed about what we need to look for, what our problems are, and how to identify leaders that prioritize this. And I think it is the same when it comes to technology. there is a prominent atmosphere or a prominent discussion when it comes to developing technology, when it comes to surveillance and privacy, that, okay, that's, if you don't have anything to hide, then why do you have problems with the governments demanding this sort of information from you? Or if you are not a criminal, then why are you so concerned about facial recognition systems? That why can't we, it's sort of innovation for the sake of innovation, tech solutionism kind of thing. And I believe that that is compounded by the fact that many people are so poorly educated or informed about the impact of the potential impacts of the deployment and integration and how technology is being coupled today in so many aspects of society. And I feel that a lot of this is deliberate on the part of our leaders. There is a huge need to for secrecy due to, let me say euphemistically, some not so democratic dealings in terms of trade deals and innovation, and in a lot of the way a lot of things are done. So, and then I think that there's also the fact that there's a lot of conversation I've been hearing about open data as well, which I agree with. I think that a lot of data creation is not really the problem, but there are problems related to its processing, its collection, its siloing, and even the disaggregation of this data, for instance. So I'm currently working on this report on the use of chatbots in Nigeria and how they are female gendered, especially the ones developed and deployed by commercial banks. And I took a look at the statistics developed by the National Bureau of Statistics. And there's a lot of information regarding the percentage of bankers that are contract workers compared to those that are fully employed by banks, which is shockingly high. But there is no information about how many female bankers there are in comparison with how many male bankers there are. And it's just a sort of weird gap. How do we then begin to target or target our policy making? How do you make these graphics, develop and visualize this data if the data is not gender disaggregated? And how do you inform people about the gaps, the needs, and so many other things? So I think that's those are some of the issues that we need to consider regarding civic engagement. And then for the second question regarding stakeholders that need to be involved, I think there are a lot of stakeholders. And I'd like to begin with the academia. So it has been my observation that I know a lot of people who are computer scientists and computer engineers who are working in this space, building technology. And it has been my observation that a lot of them have not learned their skills from the universities they graduated from, and that a lot of people are learning through informal training boot camps, and there are civil society groups that are sponsoring people. There is this old school that came up last year, very popular. A lot of people were being sponsored, and so a lot of people are learning outside institutions, outside formal educational institutions. So this question, where are young people learning from? And how do we develop curricula at universities? Curricula that would include the social sciences, the humanities, engineering fields into the development of the technology that we want to see. How do we ensure that the lecturers who are teaching these courses are being reskilled? When in my third year, my second year, I took a computer training course. It was a borrowed course, as we call it, because I studied law and not computer science. And it was to my greatest surprise that we were taken to this computer lab somewhere. And I think the computer language we were learning was BASIC. basic or one of these very old ones. And it was just very surprising. Of course, I'm not a computer scientist, so we're not computer science students, so it wasn't like we were actually going to be building anything. But I thought it was very interesting that our lecturer was teaching us, well, not even really teaching, but that we were being made to cram old programming languages that no one was really using. Its sponsorship, could African governments consider partnering with educational institutions that are developing MOOCs, for instance? How do we ensure that we are being included and able to take on the challenges of the future that we want? And then we have to consider private companies, for instance, startups. We need to think about big tech. How are these groups aware of the impact of technology? Are they informed about the impact of wanting datafication? Is it all right, for instance, for a company to send people to rural places and then have their agents take photographs of landmarks of people and then set it up on Google Maps, for instance, so that people from these rural areas are able to borrow loans? Is this innovation for the sake of innovation, or innovation so that there are more people to exploit, or so that people are more exploitable, or the forceful conversion of people into data points as well? And I think that we also need to consider if these groups are awake to their corporate social responsibilities. How are they incorporating ethical thinking about technology into their CSR? How do they embed ethics? Perhaps through internships, directly employing students, sponsoring courses, departments at universities, employing digital ethicists, for instance. Are they participating in these conversations at all? Are they aware of conventions, of treaties, of human rights laws, and all that? And then civil society, of course, they have to be awake to their responsibility of informing the populace, conducting trainings, seminars, teaching journalists, our judges, our politicians, legislators, academics, students, members of the community, keeping up to date with innovation and all that. So I think that these are some of the stakeholders that we need to be aware that are directly responsible, and some of the roles that they need to play and that they need to begin to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Favor. So I'm going to ask Carlos to give his impressions. So it's about how do we raise civil awareness, especially among vulnerable groups? And who do you think are suitable actors to regulate AI technologies? Who should be the protagonists? Who should be the champions for AI governance? How do we decide? Over to you, Carlos.
So thanks, Emma. Maybe my starting point with this question is to try to explain a little bit what we mean when we say that AI governance and regulation should be multi-stakeholder by design. And by the way, that's one of the points that end up coming out of a report that we produced at one of the global future councils from the World Economic Forum, that end up laying out some tips for regulators when addressing issues concerning AI. And one of those recommendations is to take multi-stakeholderism not only by design, but taking it seriously. And why, or what I mean by that is, when we look through the lenses of AI national strategies that we already have, it's quite striking to see that some countries, they look like they are inside test tubes they look like they are not in a region or not connected to other countries. It's really striking to see when countries end up addressing issues of AI regulation through national strategies. Looks like they are alone, and they are focusing, of course, in unlocking the good effects of AI development for their own country. But I think there is a broader need for cooperation in this area, and for us to move from having AI as a somewhat like an arms race towards competition between nations, to think about how countries interact with each other. And that connects to what Sabella was mentioning about the relations that we build through AI, because that's something that not only relates to ourselves as individuals and groups, but countries as well, and how nations end up deciding what the future with AI will look like. And I think that's something that comes out from Suzanne Andrews' a question in the Q&A box as well, thinking about how sovereignty might end up playing a role in how countries end up deciding how to regulate AI. So I think this is one starting point that we might take into account. But of course, governments are not alone in deciding how to regulate AI, and to think about this approach on being multi-stakeholder by design. Let me turn to Brazil a bit. Brazil has a very strong tradition in applying multi-stakeholderism in regulation of technologies, but I would say mostly on internet. Brazil has a multi-stakeholder Internet Steering Committee. It has its own Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights, which is a federal law that was created after a 7-year process that started out with a public consultation on the internet from 2009 to 2010. And that was the first time the Brazilian government put up an online consultation to design a draft bill of law that would be sent to the Congress later on, and was finally approved in 2014. And by being involved with this process, I think we have some lessons learned from the process in trying to engage a population from a country as big as Brazil into understanding a discussion that might be really complex, such as internet regulation. So first thing is, you cannot only count on online interactions and Zoom meetings such as this one to make sure that you will cover all the impacted groups. The offline experience of having events, roundtables that end up going into the territory where the people are in, it's really precious to make sure that you have people involved. I know that the pandemic ended up pushing us a lot to devise new methods of interaction using the internet. But I think that one lasting effect that we will have from these years of the pandemic is these needs that we have for face-to-face interactions and to meet people in person. And in order to have meaningful conversations that are important as the discussion of regulation of AI, to have that kind of encounters, the kind of meeting, I think it's really important. And this is not to say that online meetings are not important, quite the opposite. But for us, back in 2010, it was somewhat a discovery to find out that we should go to where the people are and to make sure that they are felt not only welcomed, but they have the tools to engage in the conversation. But going through the other actors in the regulation and governance of AI in a very inclusive way, I think it's important to mention, Favor addressed the issue of the academics, and I think we need to think about academics not only as developers of AI tools, not only as the professors and the holders of our arcane knowledge, but quite the opposite as well, which is to have academics as translators. And I think that's something that's really important, and I think that connects with what Favor was mentioning. We need to have academics that end up picking up the discussions of AI governance and regulation and make sure that the people understand what they are talking about and how they end up translating the most pressing issues on AI in a way in which any person can have access to an article on a newspaper, an interaction on a TV show or a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatever, and make sure that this end up reaching people and that academics end up serving as translators as well. I think that is a key element when it comes to understanding our future with AI. And when it comes to civil society, I think there are a couple of challenges that we might want to address here. And the first one is a lot of very traditional actors in civil society concerning the protection of human rights are not already, I'm not saying aware, but I would say mobilized to act on some of the most pressing issues concerning AI regulation and governance. So I think we saw in the last two decades the creation of a lot of institutions and organizations in civil society that end up addressing issues of digital rights and how AI impacts society at large. But it's important not only to make sure that those institutions exist and prosper, but at the same time to bring the traditional civil society organizations to the same level in order to make sure that they end up being a participant of these debates. And I'm thinking especially on the more traditional human rights organizations to make sure that they step in this debate, because by the end of the day, the decisions that are going to be taken on AI regulation and governance, they will impact human rights protection. And it's simply crucial to have those actors involved in the debate as well. But I think I'll stop here. Those are just a couple of comments on different actors and how they might be engaged in the discussions regarding AI governance and regulation. And thanks, Emma.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Ellen, over to you. I just want to say, can we try and more or less be done by, say, past or 2:25, so that we have time for the audience as well. Ellen and Sabelo together. So just keep in mind, so about 7 minutes each. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carlos. Really intriguing response. Ellen, over to you.
So I was thinking about the premise of your question, which is how do you raise awareness among the citizenry and particularly vulnerable groups? And I was thinking that awareness alone, particularly when you're vulnerable, really doesn't change your material position at all. Yes, we have an issue in many contexts where automated systems are being used to make decisions about people without people perhaps even being aware that they are present. But making people aware that an AI system is part of that context is the first, most baby step of moving to a position that would improve the situation for vulnerable populations. And I could give you an example from one of the contexts that I've worked in, which was the controversy over the prediction of student exam results in the UK last year. I'm not sure if you remember, but when the COVID pandemic meant that students could not sit their final exams at UK colleges and high schools, their results were predicted for them using an algorithmic system, and somewhat unsurprisingly, the system ended up predicting that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds would have lower results than their actual grades to that point indicated, and that students in higher socioeconomic areas were more likely to have better grades. So if you're a student in a low socioeconomic area, just being aware of an AI system does nothing to change that you're not being offered a place at university and that it is very hard to contest the results of that decision. What you want in a situation, particularly with vulnerable groups, is that the burden of taking action is never left to the vulnerable group. That in fact, responsibility rests with organizations who have to interact with those groups. So like, what have they done to ensure harm doesn't occur? Or what penalties will they suffer should harm occur? Whenever we leave the burden of awareness to the people we're trying to protect, I feel that it just perpetuates certain inequalities that make changing these situations difficult. Your second question was about actors and like who could be the champion for AI governance. And again, I would just return to one of my opening remarks, which was that if we cease to think of AI regulation as kind of like a one-size-fits-all model, and instead a kind of complex system of regulations, much like the way we regulate some other things like pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are not regulated once. We regulate consumer safety, we regulate medical trials, we regulate reporting, we regulate the behavior of anyone offering pharmaceuticals to particular markets through a variety of mechanisms, locally, nationally, internationally. And I keep thinking about the complete absence of any real forms of regulation for applications of AI. And two examples that I would give you to leave you with is, for example, we've talked about academics quite a bit just in the last 15 minutes. As an academic, I need credentials to teach. I also, in Australia, need a police background check, a working with vulnerable people card. However, if I want to develop a piece of software to grade student exams, I don't need any certification and I don't need any background check. Similarly, I trained as a lawyer. Were I to practice law, I need a practicing certificate in Australia, and I face penalties if I fail to stand up to my kind of duties as a lawyer. However, if I want to build a piece of software that predicts the outcome of sentencing decisions, or if I want to build software to help judges make those decisions, I don't need certification. I don't need any standards that I should adhere to. And I think that says something about the history of how we regulate many other kinds of things and where these kinds of areas could go.
Thank you. Okay, so Bello, over to you for your responses to these two issues.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Ellen. I think one of the challenges, at least in the US, that we've noticed is that it's often the marginalized groups that are the ones doing the work of educating and then working to pass legislation. For example, if we're talking about facial recognition technology being banned, this has been work pioneered by Black women who are well connected with the communities that they come from. So they're able to identify the needs of their community, and they have the technical background and the education background to then inform policy. And so this is a challenge because it is those who are disenfranchised who now have to do the work of the overbearing interest to do the work. And so that does make it difficult. Ideally, there should be bodies or institutions or legislation to forward this work, but often it's left to those who are disenfranchised. The second part of the second question, who are the people, the stakeholders who can sort of advance better protections for marginalized groups and those affected by AI. I think one of the groups to target are definitely the the students who are going through the curriculum to being trained to create AI technology engineers and so forth. There should be various people involved in this process, but at least if those who are being educated have the awareness, maybe it's through ethical courses, maybe it's through sociology courses, maybe they're able to see how technology and society are connected in various ways, then that might give them an idea of how to identify when things go wrong. But that's not enough. They should also have whistleblower protections. That way, if they recognize what's going wrong, they're able to whistleblow, they're able to speak out and be protected. Again, in the United States, what we've seen is that when prominent researchers, for example, Black women, such as Gabriella, who whistleblew at Google when she was let go and terminated, she wasn't adequately protected, right? So we need whistleblower protections. We need the next generation of technologists to also be educated on the different harms. We need corporate culture to change. We need our legislators to also then create legislation that matches what our activists and researchers are also identifying on the ground. But at the very least, we need a strong education component and whistleblower protections.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abedo. From the panelists, is there anything that you would like to say in response to any of the other panelists before we move then slowly to Q&A from the audience? Everybody happy? Okay, so then, Sabelo, while we have you now, there was a question specifically directed to you that asked, do you think we will really achieve the algorithmic decolonization of AI governance in the context of the rise of dominant data capitalism and AI?
Wow, that's a really good question. So to sort of then define data capitalism, it's this idea that the large extraction of data is sort of used to increase profits for the major corporations. And so they're incentivized to monitor our every move online and to collect as much data as they can. I mean, the truth of the matter is that that's just the fact of, and so they're very strong for the shareholders, incentives for the corporations as much money as they can. The strong incentives for them to become monopolies, right? And so it's the environment that they exist in encourages them to become that way. There's a story of how Google, when it first started, the ad revenue wasn't really their thing, but because they wanted to increase the profits for the shareholders, they ended up having to resort to this sort of ad revenue model, and what is also known as surveillance capitalism, in order to surveil people by monitoring their every moves in order to increase the profits. So oftentimes these companies are responding to the environment that they exist in. So then if the environment is also a problem, then how can we change the environment in which these companies exist in? Sometimes you'll hear that these companies, you know, they would like to maybe do the more ethical thing. But however, you know, they're always in constant competition with others. And so sometimes I feel like if they take more time to do proper research, to be more ethical, and to be more concerned about humanity instead, they might lose out on their advantage. So this does make it difficult. So how do we then decolonize in such a scenario? I think one of the ways to do so is to distribute the ability and the power to create competing and competing technologies, meaning that we can then, if we could empower different regions to be able to create their own tools, whether it's through legislation, capacity building, funding. A lot of the funding we know doesn't go to, say, the African continent, or it doesn't go to, say, women, or goes to minorities. Instead, it goes to the same groups that receive the most funding. So if we can find ways to then support alternative systems I think that is one way among many ways to sort of allow these regions to have sort of an autonomy in how they create their own feature, their own technological feature. And if we prevent sort of these large corporations from bringing in the finished product, using their power, the economy of scale to outcompete, it's not fair to the developing regions. One quick example with that, for example, we have this idea of free internet by Facebook in many countries, where Facebook will provide free data to certain websites. Now think about it. If you're a computing engineer and your app requires a lot of data, but then an app that Facebook is creating doesn't require you to pay for that data. So it's like, makes it harder for you to compete. So one way of decolonizing this specific scenario is to then empower the local developer to have tools where they can also afford to give the same incentives to their users that these large companies have to their users.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Sabelo. Then there is a question directed to Ellen. What methods for ensuring accountability are you proposing, Ellen, given that AI is transboundary and often legal rights are signed away prior to use?
I was hoping you would ask me this question. And if I just replace the word AI in that sentence with technology generally or software, I would say technology or software is not boundaryless. And in fact, our major companies have demonstrated that they will make products for particular markets that comply with that jurisdiction's needs. You know, we've seen that with the changes to the delivery of some US-based products in the European Union after the GDPR. And it's also not the case that we are always signing away legal rights. And in fact, there's certain areas of law that have held very tightly to national boundaries as a mechanism for keeping the kind of free flow of information at bay. And I'm thinking of copyright, where geo-blocking, TPMs, temporary protection measures, things that I have lobbied hard against in past life, but evidence of the ability to constrain technologies to particular boundaries when a country or a region decides it has a real case to do so. The difference that I would make in this situation is, again, just comes back to power. We are able to enforce national boundary-based regulations of technologies when those asking for them are your record labels or your movie studios or Disney. It is very hard when it's your vulnerable populations to ask for that same sovereign respect of rules. But I guess I just would say it is not impossible, and we do it. We just choose when we do it.
Thank you very much. Then there is a more general question, and this is one that can keep us busy, I think, for a very long time. But so let's give it the best shot. This is a global debate, but different actors in different parts of the world have different approaches to and understanding of ethics. If we pursue global normative approaches and regulations, who gets to decide what is ethical and what is not? So if there is any volunteer to respond to this question from the panelists. How do we deal with this tension of wanting to hear all voices, but not wanting to, still having to come up with global regulation? How it seems as if there is this eternal tension between the two. Is there a way in which we can resolve this from your experience?
I can see Sabelo in the chat saying, can he respond? So maybe we could go to him first.
Oh, okay, Sabelo, and I think Carlos also wanted to say something. Thank you, Ellen. So Sabelo, you go first, then Carlos.
Okay, so I'm turning off my video because I think my data is not strong enough. We recently published a document, a manifesto called the AI Manifesto. And the AI Manifesto is this idea that there should be varied ways of thinking about ethics globally, that there is no one way that will sort of control how AI ethics should look like. So in fact, we can have sort of many worlds existing in. And so this idea that each region can work out its own interpretation that coincides with their own value systems. One of the dangers we have is this globalism idea that, you know, if we make the technology in the United States, it's going to work well everywhere else. If we build the ethical rules in the United States, they will also be global by nature. And that is a misconception. It's a strong misunderstanding. And it sort of has like this patriarchal feel to it, that if it works in the Western world, it's good enough for everywhere else. And so that has to be challenged because it is not true in any way at all. Instead, we need to be able to conceive multiple worlds existing in one. And so I'll be sharing the link here in the chat of this decolonial manifesto that we worked on that really sort of talks more about this idea. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sabelo. Carlos, did you want to say anything? I see Favor also wants to say something on this. Carlos?
Yeah, I'll be super quick. Just to say that we might have some lessons and warnings from what we saw on internet regulation, because we somewhat see that some national regulators or lawmakers, when they turn into AI, they think, oh, we might have took too long to regulate the internet, and look what that ended up resulting. So let's not make that mistake again, and let's be quick in regulating AI. And that is something that connects to the issue of a global ethical debate, because it looks like there is a tension right now, because on one hand, we have this push to have some clarity on some global standards and understandings when it comes to principles to address key topics on AI. But on the other hand, we are seeing a somewhat speedy movement from governments in having their own say on AI regulation, and that might end up leading us to going almost like through the looking glass to the arguments that we are making here, because we do want to take into account national context. We do want to make sure that AI is not uniformly globalized, invisible to the peculiarities of different countries. But at the same time, especially because we have this the narrative of the damages that come out of AI applications, which is not only a narrative, but it's a due fact. We might have this very unfortunate scenario in which countries might end up going ahead and regulating on technologies in order to avoid problems that we do not understand how they will end up playing out in the first place. So I think this is a contradiction that we might want to address. Of course, we need to take into account local context, but at the same time, we want to make sure that regulations are interoperable enough to make sure that we don't isolate countries on the way that they end up handling artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Carlos. Favor?
Okay, so in considering global normative approaches and regulations and local context, I think that we might we are being naive in a way if we think or believe that certain local context or certain capitalist practices that occur in places like Africa and other parts of the global south are divorced or occur independently or have a certain value system that is completely completely indistinguishable from what goes on in the global north. So if we are talking about the setting up of facial recognition surveillance systems, which have been sponsored by Chinese companies, for instance, in certain African countries, we need to be aware that this is not a question of maybe Africans like facial recognition. Africans like to be surveilled by facial recognition, and that maybe there is a certain African culture or mindset that might permit this, even though there are civil movements in the global north that are vehemently campaigning against this. So I think we need to remove that thought, first of all, from back of our minds, and we need to consider that capitalism is a global industry that is well and thriving in Africa. For instance, in Nigeria last year, when we had the Twitter shutdown, Twitter ban in Nigeria, there are a lot of useful points that came from organizations like, for instance, I think Paradigm Initiative, about how telecommunication companies, for instance, need to be in Africa, in Nigeria, seem to believe or seem to prioritize their relationship with the Nigerian government, African governments, over global standards of right and wrong. Let me not say global standards of right and wrong, but conversations about human rights. And I remember during the NSAS protest about 2 years ago when MTN, a very prominent internet service provider in Nigeria, suddenly their services were no longer accessible in the region where the protests were taking place and in which there was the massacre reportedly. So it's not always that maybe there is this global norm that is not applicable in Africa. We need to prioritize human rights everywhere. And so I think that resolving the issue of different approaches to ethics and how to develop contextualized ethical approaches need to bring people who will be affected by these technologies to the table. You need to be talking with the people who will be most affected. And all over the world, these groups are different, for instance, but it's still largely the same. In the US, for instance, you would like to consider racial minorities. In Nigeria and many parts of Africa, you want to consider ethnic minorities. You want to consider class minorities, people who are disadvantaged based on their age. You want to consider people whose voices are not heard, probably based on disabilities. And these are the people you want to be hearing from in order to build norms on normative approaches to regulation. So I don't think it is right. And I think it's very convenient for people to say that that how do we bring global norms to Africa, that these things are different. But it's really not. If you listen to what people have to say about the problems that concern them, you find that people want to live in dignity. They want to have their privacy protected. They want to be happy. They want to further their lives, live rich, productive lives. And we should be prioritizing these needs. And I feel that when we really consider these things critically, we find that they are not always at variance with global norms. And I think that realizing that is one of the first steps in building these norms, ethical frameworks that we really want to see. Thank you.
Thank you for work. Ellen, did you want to comment, or can we move to the next question? We can move. Okay, then I want to move to a more concrete question so that we don't stay so very abstract. And I want to pose to Carlos. There is a comment in the chat that says there are influences from AI in our language. Humanity is multilingual, but it's becoming less so every day. Is AI an amplifier of language disappearing? Is AI making language discrimination worse?
So thanks, Emma, and thanks for the question. I think that's definitely something that we need to take a closer look, and of course my specialization here is on regulation. So my concern would be that, of course, we know how AI is being worldwide trained in English, and that's a problem when you look into different languages that are not as widely spoke. And our biggest concern here, and we see that in some national strategies that some countries might end up inserting as a national strategy to make sure that there is a push for more AI applications that end up using their national language to make sure that AI is spoken in a broader set of languages, especially because, as we know, language end up creating mindsets. So if the AI applications, they are created mostly having English as a primary language, we can see a lot of effects. And let me go from abstract to very concrete. There is a lot of discussion on how to automatize content moderation on social networks. And as we see right now, most of the results that we have concerning content moderation on social media, on social networks, they end up working a little bit better. I know that we all have our concerns with the issue, but for an English publication, you might end up having a vision of an AI application going through this specific content that is very much different from a publication that happens in Portuguese, for instance. So one of our concerns here is that when we address issues of regulation, we make sure that AI end up not being a push for some languages to be somewhat in a locked out effect, that some countries end up having a specific type of regulation that end up locking out languages from being inserted into a global debate on how AI applications are developed. But then again, I will stop here, but I think this is definitely a point of attention. We don't see that in many national strategies, but when we do see, I think it's something that we need to pay attention and to develop a little bit further.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I think, when we talk about, Sabela also wants to comment on this, but I think when we talk about this protection of language means protection of diversity and protection of culture. There are, in South Africa, we have the Masikane project that works very hard to translate on translation of indigenous languages, but I know that Sabelo also works on this. So I wanted to give Sabelo just a chance to also add to this. Thank you. Sabelo.
Thank you, Emma. I just wanted to sort of also add a little bit on why this is really important. The more that we use NLP, natural language processing, to access and interact with technology, the more important it is to have this technology available widely, even in indigenous languages, because if we don't, it only increases the digital gap. Now, there's already a digital gap that does exist. And if we're not catching up to the latest AI advances, it'll only just worsen this digital gap that that even exists. And so the state of NLP for what we call low resource languages is quite, it's like a disaster at the moment. And so this is a field that people like Masakane and others are working on to really try to improve.
Thank you. Yes, and I think you know, if we think in general about the topic of our roundtable, which is around AI governance, what is very clear from everything that we have touched on is that you cannot have this, you can't speak of governance if we don't take into consideration not just the kind of technology, because there are, you know, AI, as Ellen said, is this umbrella term, but also the specific groups on the receiving end of this technology. And we cannot talk about this being AI being a global technology if we mean by that, which the UNESCO definitely does not mean, but in some contexts it may imply that what we mean by that we want to look just through one lens. It means exactly that we have to look through all the different lenses so that we can build the puzzle, which is humanity. So I think that there is one more question that we can quickly go to Ellen with, and then I think we can have just the closing remarks. Ellen, if you can answer this super quickly. Can we consider removing the anonymity on social networks to respect ethics?
I saw this question, and I would just say that's an example of a question that articulates the nuance and the complexity of normative decisions on the internet, because anonymity means different things in different contexts. And I'll give you just one story. You know, anonymity quite often is essential to activists, political activists, sex workers, LGBTQI communities. In Australia at the moment, there is a court order that has been imposed on Twitter to try to get them to reveal the identity of a Twitter account called PR Guy, who quite often tweets insightful, potentially incriminating comments about the Australian government. And that anonymity has protected the account user in making those observations of our political system. So anonymity is an example of a value that means different things in different contexts. So I would not try and make a normative judgment in that respect.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. We had close to 350 participants at some point, and we're still around the 300. So we have had a lot of questions in the chat. Some have been answered in a written form. But you are, of course, always very welcome to contact UNESCO with any of your concerns. I saw that there was one question on what kind of support UNESCO is giving to countries in Africa for the implementation of the recommendation. And there is a lot available on UNESCO's website on this, and you can also contact the Secretariat for this. So I want to thank all the panelists. It always feels as if we don't have enough time, and it's as if we really haven't said anything, which just means, which just points to the complexity of this kind of technology that we're talking about, and the fact that it impacts on humanity, which is in itself a very complex concept. So in closing, quickly from my part, I think what is important if we think of effective AI governance, apart from constantly monitoring and evaluating existing policies, informing these processes with robust impact assessments, focusing on one way to actionalize these policies would then also be focusing on the accountability side and moving away a little bit from abstract ethical principles. On the other hand, I think it is very clear from the discussion that we need to have, for effective AI governance, we need to have nuanced and sensitive agreement. We have to hear each other in epistemic just context. We have to view everyone in this conversation, which is a global conversation, as ADG Ramos said, as credible knowers, as credible contributors. So maybe it is time for us to take time to reflect on formulation of values and to use culture not as the scissors, but as the needle, in a sense. So to use it as a kind of calculus of values or an interpretation tool to measure inclusivity and to predict adherence, because people will not adhere to policies that they did not help create and that does not reflect their interests. So something that was not particularly mentioned, but is underlying a lot of what has been said is, for instance, just a concrete example when we talk about using culture as a calculus of values. The fallback to human rights vocabulary is natural in the North, in the global North. But for instance, in the global South, as for instance in African communitarian ethics and communities, the notion of individual rights is very complex and stand in very complex and varied relations of opposition to duty-based approaches to ethics. So we have to make sure that people understand the policies from the point of view of their collective ethical system. We can use different articulations of shared values. There are many shared values, as Favor also pointed out to us, but we can use different articulations of shared values to learn to understand different cultures and their concerns, but specifically also to highlight aspects of ethical concerns that cannot otherwise be picked up on. We only use one lens through which to look at ethical concerns and to identify ethical concerns and how to address them. We are losing so much, and we will not be able to regulate this global technology. So maybe culture implemented as an interpretation tool to measure inclusivity and adherence, and to calculate and differentiate and distill values in manners that include every person. But that would have to happen in respectful and epistemically just context, in empowering context, in participatory context, and always in lawful context, because while we are embracing this notion of articulating values in different ways, we have to remember that regulation and legislation have to adhere to international law in the end. So thank you, everyone. This is very far from reflecting, giving a just reflection of what the fantastic contributions of our panelists. But I'm going to hand over to the Secretariat now for final remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Emma. On behalf of the Assistant Director General Ramos, I would like to thank wholeheartedly everyone that is taking part in this roundtable. As you know, today we had the pleasure of having Dr. Emma Ruttkamp-Bloem, Head of the Department of Philosophy, University of Pretoria, South Africa, as our moderator. Emma is a leader of the Ethics of AI Research Group at the Center for AI Research in South Africa, and she's also a member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, serving as a rapporteur of the committee. Dear Emma, thank you for your excellent moderation. Thank you for your time. We know how busy you are these days, and we really deeply appreciate the dedication that you keep giving to UNESCO. Thank you very much. We also had the distinguished panel members from around the world who gave us a deep insight into the issues of ethics of AI and governance, and by doing so really advanced our knowledge with their reflection. So I would really like to thank Carlos Affonso Souza, Director of the Institute of Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro, and Professor of Law, Rio de Janeiro State University. It was really great to hear about your take on the need for generational context when we're talking about the governance, and the need for multi-stakeholder engagement, particularly the emphasis that you have placed on the language, and giving us some concrete experience from Brazil's experience. We at UNESCO specifically appreciate your notion of academics as translators, bridging the knowledge with the policy and general public awareness, and this is very well noted here at UNESCO. I would like to really thank Ellen Broad, Associate Professor with the 3A Institute, Australian National University, and member of Australian Government's Data Advisory Council. Ellen, it was really insightful, your thoughts. And we take note that we are really how novel these technologies are, and how new the corresponding regulations, and how early we are in this journey to be taken in ensuring that they are serving us and not violating our rights. And we really take your emphasis on trying to avoid fixation on the technology, divorced from culture and societal context and the dynamics of power. This is indeed very important, and we'll be continuing to reflect on this, because as you've mentioned many times, these are very complex issues. I would like to thank Sabelo Schlebi also for the practitioner fellow at Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab and the founder of Bala AI, fellow at the Berkman and Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Very interesting reflections and notion that we cannot resolve the issues with data, with more data, and because the biases are set to creep in unless we go to more fundamental level of guiding values and the philosophy that we are using on developing the AI, and then understanding, going back to the very fundamental questions of what it means to be human, and whether we're talking about rational human or relational human. And so we will definitely look into the AI manifesto, because this is a really interesting concept that we need to also reflect in our own work. Last but certainly not the least, we would like to thank the panelist Favor Boccorini, who is an AI and tech policy researcher with Policy, an award-winning Ugandan feminist collective and civic technology organization. We really appreciate your deep and pervasive, your deep insight into the pervasive impact of the AI on gender equality, specifically in Africa, and the importance of funding. This is something that UNESCO is really working on to make sure that there's equity when it comes to the implementation of the recommendation on ethics of AI that we have adopted, especially in regards to building capacity of African countries in Africa, also in SIDS, to implement this, and resources are needed for that, and we are promoting that idea. And also your emphasis on the need for civil society engagement in governance. We really appreciate these insights. We would like to thank the government of Japan and Ministry of Education, Culture, Sport, Science and Technology, and personally Ambassador Oike, who has participated and followed our discussion, for the support for the series of roundtables on the topic of ethics of AI and on ethics of genome editing that were launched in 2018. There was a first roundtable on artificial intelligence in 2018 on reflection on its complexity and impact on society. Then the second roundtable in 2019 on evolving interactions between humans and AI. There was a third roundtable on shaping the future of AI through cultural diversity last year, and now we have the fourth one on AI and governance. So this has been delivering these roundtables has brought us to the very core of UNESCO's mandate in making sure that the society is aware of the emerging technologies that are set to affect their lives fundamentally and to emphasize the ethical aspects of them. Also funded by Japan, we have produced a series of short educational and informative videos on ethics of AI and on ethics of genome editing that are available through UNESCO's YouTube. You will find the link to the video in the program of this roundtable as well. We're pleased to announce that the new edition of the short video of ethics of AI, titled Shaping AI Through Cultural Diversity, will be released next week, and we will send you the link to the new video once it is released. The last point I would like to make is, before you sign off, please take a few minutes to fill out the satisfaction survey that you will see now on the screen. I think it has been shared for a few minutes now. Feel free to leave us comments and any other questions that you might have. Please note that this is really important for us because we keep trying to continuously improve this type of awareness raising events that we deliver, and so this is we really appreciate your feedback on that. With that, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the entire UNESCO, and wish you a wonderful day ahead. Thank you very much.